I'm going to talk primarily about 2015 because that's, I think, the most timely topic for today's discussion. At the beginning of the 2015 process, there was a lot of optimism that Congress would be able to complete action on all 12 appropriation bills before October 1st, primarily because there was a two-year budget deal where there was agreement between the administration and Congress as to what the total resources would be available for the appropriation bills. So it was $1.014 trillion, which was a pretty modest $2 billion increase over the 2014 final appropriations. If you remember last year, there was a huge difference between the House and the Senate before they had the deal arranged. So the House had been working off a $967 billion number. The Senate was $1.048 billion, and they ended up essentially splitting the difference in the final bill. But it meant there were huge differences between the House and the Senate in individual bills leading up to the budget deal. So, for example, the energy and water bill that includes reclamation, the difference was about $4 billion. It was only about $30 billion when the House started their process last year, about $34 billion in the Senate, and that was just a huge difference gap to make up. The good news is that the House and Senate started much closer together. There's only about a $200 million difference between the House and the Senate on the allocations for the energy and water bill this year. And the other good news is the House has passed their appropriation bill. They passed it last Thursday after 2 days of debate. What has not worked out as well as planned is that the Senate process has fallen off track, and the Senate had done a preliminary markup in subcommittee of the energy and water bill back on June 17th. They announced there were significant increases for reclamation, but the bill has never been filed or gone to committee, and it's not clear what the schedule will be for that. So the table that is up on the screen may be a little hard to read from where your seats are. Maybe your eyes are better than mine, but I'll just cover a little bit on what has happened in the 2015 process so far. On the left column, we have the 2014 enacted for comparison purposes. 2015 President's budget is the second column. And then when you move into that third column, that shows what the House did on the floor. The only difference in funding levels when they went from full committee to the floor action last week is they added $10 million to the category of rural water, and that funding actually was, all these amendments have to be zero sum. There can be no additions to the bill on the floor, but in that case, they moved money from the Department of Energy over to the Bureau of Reclamation and used the category of rural water as where they wanted to place the funding. If you look at the water and related resources account, it's considerably down from what the President's budget, it's up from the President's budget, but that's because they have incorporated the separate appropriation accounts that have been proposed in the President's budget now for 3 years for Indian water rights settlements and for the San Joaquin River Restoration Program, which is a litigation settlement in California. And they have not chosen to fund those in separate appropriation accounts. So they fold them into water and related resources, and for that reason we show a subtotal for comparison purposes. So you can compare 14 enacted, 15 President's budget, and then the House floor action. And then there are the other appropriation accounts where the House cut our policy administration account, which is our admin account to provide centralized operations for reclamation. They did similar things in the Assistant Secretary of Civil Works program for the Army Corps of Engineers, similar things for the Department of Energy. We're quite hopeful that those will get reversed in the final outcome on a bill. And then they fully funded the California Bay Delta Restoration Account and the Central Valley Project Restoration Fund. So if you look at it in total, that subtotal for reclamation is probably the most pertinent comparison. And that's where you see the House outcome is about a $22 million reduction from the President's budget request. It's a more significant reduction for the compared with 2014 enacted. And then for the Senate, because they don't have an official bill or report that has been published yet, and until they do full committee action, it doesn't have official standing in the process per se. We just have a footnote on this table. But as Lowell had mentioned, the Senate has been far more supportive of reclamation because of, I think, the composition of the membership of the subcommittee and the overall appropriation committee. They're just more Westerners that have an interest in the reclamation program. So in the Senate, you'll see that they provide a total of $1.23 billion, which is over $115 million above the enacted for 2014, and $187 million above the president's budget. So those are very good marks comparatively with the House. And what you see in the House and the Senate is that in this non-earmark environment that we're currently working in Congress, they cannot designate money for individual projects. So what they've done over the last few years is develop a group of categories where if they choose to alter the funding from the president's budget request, they will allocate it to a category of funding. And then ultimately, if they do a final conference report, which is we're very hopeful they will get to this year, they will identify individual amounts for all of the projects compared to the president's budget. But in this non-earmark environment, they'll have categories. There have been about 5 of them that have been developed. Water conservation delivery is one that was added on or at least discussed on the House floor this year. There's been one for facility operation, maintenance, and rehabilitation. In the last few years, there's nothing in the current House bill for that category. The rural water is one that they added in committee to add money to the existing authorized rural water projects, and they added $31 million in the current version of the bill on top of the president's budget, which was about $34 million. And then they've had a category for environmental compliance and restoration, and they've had a category for fish screens and fish passage. So we will see how that works out. Our assumption is that the Senate, in adding as much money as they did, would have been primarily adding to those categories or other ones that they may have developed in their process this year. But we don't have the evidence in the form of a bill or report as to exactly how they accomplished that. So as we approach the August recess, that will leave very little time for further action on appropriations in the month of September. We're expecting that we'll be under a continuing resolution to begin the new fiscal year on October 1st. There's been no substantive discussion that I'm aware of as to the length of a continuing resolution. One could suggest that it may be just for several weeks until they get agreement on a final appropriation bill. More likely, they may do a continuing resolution until after the election in November. And then there's also the possibility that they could do it all the way until the next calendar year when there would be a new Congress. So there's a lot of options as to how the Congress may choose to address that, working with the administration. We'll just have to wait and see how that works out. The other, I'll call it a drag on the appropriation process, is that the administration did release a statement of an administration policy on the energy and water bill the day before the floor action, and they are threatening a veto on the bill, primarily over Department of Energy issues and concerns about funding levels there. And then they also mentioned environmental riders. There were 2 provisions, General Provision 105 and General Provision 106 in the bill that came out of committee that deal with Clean Water Act and the Army Corps of Engineers program, and environmental riders in general, and those 2 specifically were called out in the State statement of administration policy. On the floor action, there were 3 or 4 amendments that addressed funding. I mentioned the addition to the rural water funding category of $10 million. That was in addition to Reclamation's funding. There were other ones for smaller amounts of money. There was a $3 million and a $1 million amendment that passed, but those were within available funds. So they would be offset within the program to fund those categories. They cited water conservation and delivery and environmental restoration projects were the 2 categories. And then the individual members expressed their views on how they would like to see that money allocated in a final bill. There were other amendments, a $52 million amendment to try to add funding to Title 16. That one failed. And then there were some other general provision types of amendments that also failed and were not adopted. One of them was withdrawn. So I think that captures where we are on the Senate and the House for the appropriation process. We're, again, hopeful that we'll have a CR that will at least allow us funding to begin the fiscal year on October 1st. And we're hopeful that they'll get some agreement between the House and the Senate and the administration on how to proceed so that we get funding in place in a reasonable time. It's been extremely difficult for Reclamation as an agency in years when we've not gotten final funding allocations until at least one year. It was as late as April. In other recent years, it's generally been in the late December to March timeframe. So it just makes it very difficult to operate a program and do it in a reasonable fashion. The final thing I will just mention is on 2016. We're fairly far along in the 2016 process. We expect to have a budget that will go over to OMB on the normal time frame of September. And then OMB will be reviewing the 2016 request and giving us decisions back sometime late fall, early winter. And the normal process would be we would get final decisions sometime in early December and then turn that into a president's budget that would be delivered to Congress the first Monday in February. As many of you know, in recent years, because there have been delays in the congressional appropriation process from the prior year, the administration has chosen to wait until they had a better understanding of the outcome of that process before they did final decisions on the president's budget. And the president's budget has gone up typically in the March to even April timeframe in recent years. So again, we're hopeful. There's the 2-year budget agreement, which would allow us, if they can get past some of these other issues, to get to a final bill. There would hopefully not be too big a difference between the overall allocations between the House and Senate, which facilitate that process. So once they get the go-ahead to do a conference on an appropriation bill, and it should be easier than it was last year, but there are still issues to be worked out.